All right, let's dive into one of the most chaotic, most intense, and honestly, most important periods in all of human history. We're talking about the first half of the 20th century. Between 1914 and 1945, the world was completely turned upside down by two world wars, a massive economic collapse, and brand new ideas that would change the map forever.
You know, the famous historian Eric Hobsbawm had the perfect name for this era. He called it the Age of Extremes. And it's such a fitting name because it was a time of just unbelievable, mind-bending contradictions. Think about it like this. On one side, you have humanity making these incredible leaps forward. We've got scientific breakthroughs, medicine is getting better, life expectancy is actually going up, new art forms like movies are taking off, and the idea of democracy is starting to spread. But on the other side, at the exact same time, you have this rise of super-aggressive nationalism, the horror of total war on a scale nobody had ever imagined, and a global economic collapse that threw millions and millions of people into poverty. It was truly the best of times and the absolute worst of times, all happening at once.
So, where does this story even begin? Well, it starts with a conflict so huge, so unbelievably destructive, that people actually called it the war to end all wars. They genuinely believed that after this was over, humanity would never, ever fight on that scale again. But, as we're about to see, that hope was tragically wrong.
A war this big doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. The stage had been set for years by four big long-term causes. And here's a little trick to remember them. Just think of the word MAIN. M is for militarism. Countries were in a massive arms race, building up huge armies and navies. A is for alliances. Europe was secretly divided into two rival teams, like a giant schoolyard fight waiting to happen. I is for imperialism. All these big powers were scrambling to grab colonies and resources around the world. And finally, N is for nationalism, this intense, over-the-top pride in your own country that often turned into real hatred for your neighbors. Europe was basically a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And that spark came on June 28, 1914. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was next in line to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was assassinated. Austria-Hungary immediately blamed Serbia and, exactly 1 month later, declared war. And that's when all those secret alliances kicked in like a row of dominoes. Russia backed Serbia, so Germany, who was allied with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. Then France and Britain, who were allied with Russia, got pulled in, and just like that, within a week, the entire continent was at war.
After 4 long, brutal years, World War I was finally over. Everyone was desperate for a lasting peace. But the treaty that was supposed to deliver that peace, well, it was built on some pretty shaky ground. In fact, you could argue it practically guaranteed another war was coming.
And this brings us to one of the biggest questions of the 20th century. Was the Treaty of Versailles a genuine effort to create peace? Or was it really just a recipe for revenge that would only lead to more conflict down the road?
The terms of the treaty were incredibly harsh, especially for Germany. It was forced to accept 100% of the blame for starting the war. It lost huge chunks of valuable territory, its once powerful army was taken apart, and maybe worst of all, it was ordered to pay a crushing amount of money, called reparations, to the winning countries. You can just imagine the deep burning anger and humiliation this created across all of Germany.
Now, one hopeful idea did come out of the treaty, the League of Nations. The goal was fantastic: get countries to talk through their problems instead of fighting. But right from the start, it had two fatal flaws. First, it had no army to actually enforce its decisions. And second, some of the most powerful countries in the world, like the United States, never even joined. So it was basically a watchdog with no teeth.
So, the world is trying to recover from this massive war. But the crisis wasn't over, not by a long shot. Two other huge events were about to shake the entire globe to its core: a radical revolution in Russia and an economic collapse that would spread like a virus.
So while World War I was still raging, a massive revolution exploded in Russia. The old empire of the Tsar was completely overthrown, and after a nasty civil war, the world's very first communist state was born, the USSR. The creation of the Soviet Union sent shockwaves everywhere. It introduced a brand new, powerful ideology, communism, that was the total opposite of the West and would basically define global politics for the next 70 years.
Then, in 1929, the whole world economy just imploded. The Great Depression was terrible everywhere, but it was an absolute catastrophe in Germany. Remember, they were already struggling with those war payments, and now the American loans they relied on just vanished. The impact was unbelievable. Unemployment just skyrocketed. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans had no job. The country was drowning in despair.
People were beyond desperate. It became a common sight to see men on the street wearing signs just like this one, willing to do any work. This wasn't just some economic statistic. This was a human crisis. It took away people's jobs, their life savings, and their sense of dignity. And it's exactly in this kind of environment, this mix of national humiliation, fear, and total desperation, that dangerous new leaders and really radical ideas start to look appealing. When people feel like the system has completely failed them, they start listening to strong men who promise easy answers, which almost always leads to the rise of dictators.
And the most powerful of these new ideologies was fascism. So what even is it? Well, at its heart, fascism is all about extreme aggressive nationalism. The country and its leader are everything, and you have to give them your absolute loyalty. It celebrates violence and war as ways to make the nation strong, and it is absolutely ruthless in crushing anyone who disagrees.
And of course, the most infamous fascist leader was Adolf Hitler in Germany. His rise to power wasn't an accident. It was a very deliberate process. First, he played on that deep, widespread anger about the Treaty of Versailles. Second, he made promises that desperate people wanted to hear. He'd restore Germany's pride, tear up the treaty, and this was a big one, he'd create jobs. Third, he was a master of propaganda, using huge rallies and powerful symbols to create this feeling of strength and unity. And it worked. By 1932, his Nazi party was the biggest in Germany, which allowed him to grab total, absolute power.
So, with dictators like Hitler now in charge, obsessed with conquest and racial purity, that peace built on sand finally crumbled completely. The world was about to be dragged into a second global war, one that would be even more terrifying and far more destructive than the first.
The war kicked off in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. Things went truly global in 1941 when Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor brought the incredible industrial power of the USA into the fight. Hitler made a fatal mistake in 1942 by invading the massive Soviet Union. The real turning point on that front was the brutal Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, a devastating defeat that the German army just never recovered from. From then on, it was a slow, bloody retreat for the Axis powers, until their final surrender in 1945.
And just like in the First World War, the world split into two main teams. You had the Axis powers, led by Germany, Italy, and Japan, and fighting them were the Allied powers, this huge alliance that eventually included Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, all fighting together to stop the Axis takeover. But World War II wasn't just about battles and armies. Under the cover of all that chaos, the Nazis carried out one of the most horrific crimes in human history, the Holocaust. Fueled by a disgusting ideology of racial purity, they engineered a systematic, factory-like genocide. 6 million Jewish people were murdered, along with millions of others that the regime considered undesirable. It is truly humanity's darkest hour, and it serves as a permanent reminder of where unchecked hatred can lead. By 1945, the war was over. Cities were just piles of rubble. Entire countries were in ruins. But out of all that destruction, the survivors had to figure out, how do we build a new world? And more importantly, how do we make sure this never, ever happens again?
The human cost of the Second World War is almost impossible to wrap your head around. It was so much deadlier than the first. While we'll never know the exact number, historians estimate that somewhere around 70 million people were killed, and the vast majority of them were civilians. It's a number so large it's hard to comprehend, and it really shows the terrifying scale of this global tragedy.
So what were the lasting effects? Well, the world map was completely redrawn. The old colonial empires of Europe basically crumbled. Taking their place were two brand new superpowers who would dominate the globe for decades, the United States and the Soviet Union. On the home front, the huge role that women played in the war effort helped speed up the push for the right to vote. And, hoping to learn from the failure of the League of Nations, a new organization was created to try and keep the peace, the United Nations.
And that really brings us right up to today. The United Nations was founded with one main goal: to save future generations from the scourge of war. So the final question, the one that connects all of this history directly to our own lives, is this: has it succeeded?